Now we move on to the next speaker, Ambassador Ries. He's the Vice President of the RAND Corporation, and the ambassador also had a very long and distinguished career in the diplomatic service. You have seen, let's say, the administration from the inside, and now you see it from the outside. So you can maybe comment also, besides the point you want to make about, let's say, your assessment of the administration response to these crises, the one in Ukraine and the one in the Middle East. Specifically about Ukraine, we have seen hybrid warfare and the development of hybrid threats. So I would like you to assess that. Tell us, are we prepared? Is the Western Alliance prepared to deal with cyber threats, cyber security, or other types of hybrid warfare?
Thank you very much, Paul. It's great to be here. Great to see you again, Mr. State Secretary. We had the pleasure of hosting you at RAND earlier this year, and it's a wonderful opportunity for me to again address this group. But since I have done so before, I think I can be somewhat briefer. I spoke yesterday about ways to reduce Europe's vulnerability to the gas weapon and the sort of the energy dependency problem. We talked about that. And then earlier today we talked about a political strategy, particularly aimed at ISIS and the sort of challenges that we face from this very barbaric group in the Middle East. I'd like to, in my own comments here, answer your question. First of all, let me say to both Evelyn and the State Secretary, I think the NATO summit was an absolute home run last month. I think you did a fantastic job of preparing it. It announced a number of initiatives that should allow for our military forces in the alliance to be more capable, interoperable, responsive, and particularly to increase their presence in Eastern Europe. So that's really a very important step. And more broadly, my own sense from the outside is the administration has done a really excellent job. I spent 4 years, probably the worst 4 years of the U.S.-European relationship as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of the State Department for Europe, 2000 and 2004. There were really dark days of U.S.-European relations, and it's just a pleasure to see it work well, where the administration is careful to consult with the Europeans. They're careful, both major European capitals, Brussels and the U.S., to demonstrate to Moscow, which was watching very carefully, and Kyiv, who was very worried, that we were in sync, in step, and had a conception. So I think it's really just as a former diplomat, it was quite impressive. And State Secretary, to you, I think it was a great thing. The Prime Minister was in Kyiv yesterday, took Moldovan Prime Minister, and I think did really good work. And in general, Romania has been a rock for the alliance in this part of the world. Not shaken by developments, understood that what was required was steadiness of nerve, clear understanding of where your interests lie, and I think that that's really good. So let me just say a couple things about what ought to be done now in this next phase. I think, as I mentioned earlier this morning, that I think that the big challenge is that we need to sort of have a conceptual development of our thinking about how to deal with these irregular military forces, hybrid warfare, the integration of political, informational, and economic tools that we saw the Russian Federation display in Ukraine, and to a lesser extent that we're seeing in the Middle East. I think NATO is very important, and certainly conventional military deterrence is vital. But we need to do our own conceptual thinking about how we would respond in further such irregular scenarios, how we would integrate other elements of national power to respond, how we can do better on the propaganda side, et cetera, because these we still have vulnerabilities in these areas, and if we can do that, we'll certainly be better placed both to deter action and to respond to it if it nonetheless happens without necessarily escalating to conventional forces. So I think each of the nations in the alliance really should do a kind of a bottom-up, very serious security review that are more than just the sort of instruments of conventional military forces, but that are comprehensive and bring together all the multiple ministries involved in integrating responses in these other scenarios. And you know, once countries have a sense of what the challenges are, what they might do, then we need to bring this up to the regional level in this region, especially in the region that faces these threats directly, but then also at the level of the alliance. And finally, you would not be surprised that I think that ultimately we do need to start thinking about ways to de-escalate the circumstances with the Russians. I think we need to be, you know, very cautious, not at all do anything that might indicate that we have lost our nerve, but indicate that they're, you know, if they behave better, there would be some interim rewards for that kind of thing. And I was pleased last week or the week before to see some new indications that the Russians are open to cooperation in the space station and these other kinds of things. And I think we need to think about how we would signal response. I was in Moscow last week on another trip and didn't see anybody in the government, saw a lot of private Russians that are obviously very concerned and worried about what's happening on the economic side and the future of their country in relationship to the West. And those people ultimately are potential allies in the effort to have Russia understand that this particular thrusted approach is not the way to increase their own national interest. But many of them were convinced that our sanctions were aimed not at responding to specific egregious violations of international law and practice that the Federation did in Ukraine and Crimea, but also they were aimed at regime change. And you know, not even the Iranians think that we're aimed at a regime change in our sanctions policy, and we need to find ways to signal to the Russians that it isn't about regime change, it's about specific behaviors and being a responsible member of the international community. But so if we making our conventional forces better prepared, more resilient, more flexible, showing the flag in this part of the world, looking at new ways to deal with the unconventional threats, building up our own capacity, and then from a position of strength, signaling to the Russians that there would be proportionate benefits to them if they could do what it is that they have signed up to do in the memorandum of September 5th and the protocol of September 19th. Thanks.